Hi, Caroline Scruggs, Assistant Professor, Community and Regional Planning, the University of New Mexico. And Caroline is our newest member of the faculty, just finishing up your dissertation from Stanford University, and you'll be starting in the fall 2012 at the University of New Mexico.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it.
Well, we're looking forward to having you. It's very exciting that you'll be joining us.
Excellent.
We know that you just finished your dissertation and that you defended successfully, of course, and that you're already in the midst of publishing some of the work out of your dissertation. But before we get to that, I know that you came into the world of environmental science having been in the world of engineering. You were an engineer for a while, a practicing engineer. Tell us about some of your work.
Okay, yeah, maybe I'll talk about that briefly and talk about how it sort of bleeds into my dissertation.
That would be perfect.
Okay, so I have 2 degrees in environmental engineering, bachelor's and master's from Virginia Tech, and I then went into consulting, and that was my first career for 10 years. And during that time, I worked on a lot of different water quality projects, and what I became most interested in was this issue of what were called emerging contaminants or contaminants of concern. There are a lot of different names people use. And so these chemicals contaminate ecosystems, and they cause a lot of problems for wildlife, fish, alligators, frogs, a lot of different types of organisms. And from the engineering perspective, we were always looking at how can we try to remove these types of contaminants from wastewater, from water, and keep from polluting the environment. And I got really interested in the technologies around that, but even more interested in the fact that there aren't really regulations in place to protect our ecosystems from these sorts of damages. And so you can throw...
Now, is this in a U.S. context?
In a U.S. context, but it's really a worldwide issue. In the U.S., we've solved enough other human health and environmental problems that we are looking at these kinds of details. In the developing world, they're not, they're still solving some bigger human health and environmental problems, and maybe not at this scale yet, but it's a global issue. And so you can throw a lot of money at technologies to try to clean all this stuff out of water before it gets into the environment. And these are very energy, resource intensive types of technologies that, do have environmental implications as well for climate change and other kinds of problems. And so at that point, this kind of leads into my dissertation work, which really focused more in on the policy and regulatory aspect here. And something else I learned while I was an engineer is that you can talk about all of these environmental damages and the effects on wildlife and that type of thing, but it doesn't really hit home for people until you can link it to human health as well. And so my dissertation is still looking at this same type of problem, but it's in the context of consumer products and the 84,000 plus chemicals that are registered for use in the United States today. But very, very few of those chemicals have had any kind of testing to see their effects on human health or environmental health. And so that's kind of where my dissertation focused in, and it's looking at both the environmental and the human health aspects of all these different chemicals that are in use on a daily basis.
You said 84,000.
84,000, and it's something 5 have been regulated in the past 30 some years since the regulations that control many of these chemicals were passed in 1976, have not been changed in any significant way since then. And basically it's up to the U.S. government and the taxpayers basically to test chemicals for safety, but they're already on the market. So
they got on the market before the testing.
Yeah, and at the rate the government is going with testing, it'll take 20,000 years, some people say, to test all those chemicals. So there's clearly an issue here, and we're all part of the big experiment at this point with all these chemicals that we use in our daily lives, but we don't understand how they affect us or the environment for the most part.
So some of those 5 chemicals that we are regulating are which ones?
Well, there are things like certain uses of asbestos, but the asbestos case was really interesting. The EPA worked for 10 years to put that case together, and it ended up getting overturned, actually. So that's not really even a chemical that we can count. And the uses that have been restricted are ones that are no longer in use anyway. There are certain types of PCBs, hexavalent chromium. There are a few other, just certain uses of certain chemicals that
that we know have
that we know have effects, but there are a lot of other chemicals today that we know have effects on humans and the environment. But there's a battle oftentimes with industry, and there are lawsuits involved if the EPA or other groups start saying that certain chemicals shouldn't be used. That turns into sort of a battle of different groups' research and that type of thing. One really good example that's been in the news a lot are flame retardants. And so flame retardants are probably in the foam of the chair you're sitting in. They're in 85% of the baby products. I'm pregnant and I'm very concerned about this kind of thing right now. They're in 85% of the baby products that are tested. These are chemicals that are known to cause tumors in lab animals, and they've been linked to tumors and all kinds of other problems in humans, yet we still use them. In the state of California, there's this flammability standard. It's called the Technical Bulletin 117, TB 117, in the state of California, that requires manufacturers to meet certain flame standards that basically people have shown that these tests actually don't really even do what they say they're supposed to do. But we're adding all these chemicals to products to meet those kinds of standards that are supposedly ineffective.
So the standards get established. It really is a way to call for the
increased
use of those kinds
of these chemicals. And the industry, the chemicals industry, spends millions and millions of dollars lobbying to keep these rules on the books. And so in the meantime, we're and our children are exposed to these chemicals on a daily basis. If you swept up all the dust in your home, most homes have levels of flame retardants at the pound level in the dust that accumulates in our homes from the foam, and from these things migrate out of furniture and other types of products. So I think it's kind of a scary thing, and it's something that the public is largely unaware of. That's just one example of flame retardants. The Chicago Tribune just did a 4-day expose on this, the deception by industry, the ineffective regulations that are in place, the sort of front groups that are things like Citizens for Fire Safety, that are really industry groups that keep driving this forward. So it's a really interesting topic, but something the public is largely unaware of. And I find the whole chemicals issue to be so interesting because it's very different from any other of our, things like climate change, species diversity, a lot of the other issues that get attention these days around human health and the environment. People are just largely unaware of this one, and there's a lot of misinformation. There are a lot of assumptions. People assume that if a product is for sale, it must be safe. Mm-hmm. The government must be doing all this, robust testing and such to make sure that the public is safe from all these different chemicals, or just that the products that we're using are safe. But it's actually really not the case. And
so at least in some cases there is some science, because you said we know that. So at least in some cases we do know there are a connection between some of these chemicals and their impact on human health.
Yes, and environmental health, yes.
So, and that's been through the experiment. So in those cases, it's a matter of politics, I guess, and trying to get those chemicals regulated. But it sounds like there's other chemicals that we haven't even yet tested.
That's correct,
that we can only hypothesize based on their chemical compositions that they may likely have an effect on humans.
Exactly. Yeah, and even with the chemicals that have been linked to problems in humans, you can't really do experiments on humans. Let's expose this baby to flame retardants for 5 years and see how many and what kind of tumors it develops. Like you can't do that. And so the human health, what we know about chemicals in human health, is largely just based on these linkages.
So we know that they've had then these tumors that have grown in.
Yeah, or if there's a population that for whatever reason has been exposed to a lot of, somebody just did this in a group of people who live on some islands that through the fish that they eat, they've been exposed to, it's PFOS is the abbreviation, PFOS, and it's a water repellent, stain repellent kind of chemical. And they were able to show that these children had quite high levels, but not that different from kids in the U.S. as well, and their immune response was much lower likely because of these chemicals. But it's all links where we can't do experiments on babies or kids or whatever, so it's a different way of having to do that science, whereas with lab animals we can do the testing. But
So in those cases, it's a matter of association.
yeah, exactly.
So what did you do in your dissertation then?
So for my dissertation, so what I'm talking about is a very messy situation, and there are a lot of people in our society, including businesses, who aren't really aware of this problem, or it's just not on their radar for whatever reason. But for some companies who make consumer products, so not the chemicals industry, but companies that make consumer products, some of them actually are very aware of these problems, and they're working on these issues behind the scenes to keep these hazardous chemicals out of their products. And so I was able to interview 20 very, very large multinational companies about their chemicals use and how they get information about the hazards of the chemicals that they use and that type of thing. And they spoke with me very frankly about these issues. So the interviews were done on condition of anonymity, and I was able to collect up a lot of information that really revealed the gaps in our chemicals regulations, and also helped highlight the policies that could be put in place to really help protect human and environmental health better than we are today.
So you're ending up with some policy recommendations.
Yeah.
What
yeah.
are some of those?
So there are two major things really. One is to actually have industry help collect up data and actually help contribute to our knowledge about what all of these different chemicals do, so that these businesses aren't just going to, Google and any place they can find information is what they're doing now, and that's very expensive for them. And each business doing that will reach a different conclusion about the safety of all these different chemicals. So if we had a better way of collecting up this data and making it available,
All the current research on it.
Yeah, or even just new research, and like I said, it's going to take our EPA years and years and years, hundreds, thousands of years to actually test all these chemicals that are in use. So having industry be a part of that program, which is what's happening in Europe now. And another thing that would be incredibly useful is to have along the supply chain, as any given product is being created, before, it starts at raw materials and it ends up on the shelves at Target or wherever. To have each of those different actors along that supply chain communicate about what chemicals are being used and how, and then that would help businesses decide what chemicals to use, even first of all understand what chemicals are in their products, and then be able to put some restrictions on what's actually in that product, so they can understand the safety of that product for humans and the environment.
Well, with that kind of interest on consumer products and the relationship between chemical use and human health, it sets you up to then, in your world of, as a community and regional planning professor, then to look at questions of environmental policy, questions that make those connections between environmental conditions and human health, between the use of certain kinds of chemicals and human health. So how do you see now yourself making the transition into some of the classes that you're going to be teaching? You'll be starting in the fall, teaching some new classes. What are some of the classes you're going to be teaching?
Well, I'd like to just this whole idea of the politics, the stakeholders, everything that surrounds environmental policy, taking that understanding from my dissertation and applying it to a lot of different types of environmental and human health types of issues.
So the different actors.
Yeah. How does this really work, and how does the science come into play? How do the different stakeholders interact and affect policy? And it's messy. We think of it as being this linear, kind of easy process where everyone's thinking logically and out for the good of human health and the environmental health issues, but it's actually a much messier situation. So I'll be teaching several classes that kind of relate to that. There's one that's, I think it's called Environmental Policy, Politics, and Stakeholders, and just by the title, I think you can see the topic there. And we'll be covering a lot of different controversial environmental issues and looking at the local, regional, national, and global scales on those kinds of issues. And then I'll have another one called Consumerism and Consumer Products. And that one will be highlighting a lot of what I was just talking about, just the even people who think, myself included, you're doing the right thing. There's a lot of things that we aren't really aware of in just the way we live our lives and the systems that are set up, the systems that are in place today. And how can we rethink some of those systems in a much more long-term thinking sort of way? I think a lot of what we do is based on short-term effects. We're not thinking that far down the road, and there are a lot of
energy policy is an example.
Energy policy is a fabulous example of that, and there are a lot of different environmental issues that fall into this type of category. And so that'll be an interesting class, and getting into GDP and what is that really measuring, and what might be some better metrics to be using, and that type of thing. Let's see. I'll be teaching.
And that's the value of planning too.
That's the other class too that I'll be creating is called Planning Sustainable Communities, and again bringing home these ideas I've already mentioned, where students will be matched with mentors in the community and really get their hands into real life projects in Albuquerque, trying to deal with some of these issues. Whether it's a bike share program or something about education around an environmental topic or safe routes to school, those types of things, getting the students thinking about real problems and how they might go about helping to solve some of these types of issues.
And that's the nice thing about our program, for example, and a professional degree like ours, where on one hand, they're going to get exposed to the rigors of research techniques, for example, and the rigors of other planning processes and techniques, the theories, the current research and literature on these various topics, but at the same time, the practical experience and practical knowledge about how you actually engage and try to have an impact on the outcome, in this case, of a given policy. So it's a nice way to get students engaged.
And I'm really excited because I feel like my background sets me up well for that too. So I have the science and engineering background, and the solving practical problems is definitely an interest from that, being in that world for me. But then my PhD was largely social science, learning a lot about sociology, business, policy, and trying to knit all of these things together with this kind of undertones of science. And now moving into the academic world, trying to pull together the natural and social sciences, and how can I help students really affect their communities using all these different sorts of, my PhD was an interdisciplinary one, and I think that planning is definitely an interdisciplinary sort of program. And how can I help students learn to think in an interdisciplinary way to try to solve these real problems in their communities?
Very well said, because really when we're facing problems, it isn't about, okay, the narrowness of a particular discipline, but how do you then draw upon the various disciplines and the knowledge that gets produced in those disciplines and combine those in a way that enables you to really address the problems and address the issues.
Yeah, definitely. And that was something that frustrated me in engineering, and one of the reasons I was trying to kind of break out of it's kind of a narrower focus, a narrower way of thinking about problems, that in, I think, planning, there's more of an appreciation for the community around the problem. And you might have the best solution in the world, you think, to a problem, but unless it's something that actually works for that community, it's not going to be successful.
Or takes into account the other variables. I mean, engineers, let's say if they're developing a road, they're going to focus on, let's say, the traffic. Where you bring a planning or a community approach to it, there's going to be other variables that are going to be part of that conversation. I find the issue of causation very interesting, especially in some of the work that you've been doing, right? Because on one hand, a lot of policies get made without really thinking through whether or not there's a causal justification for it. But on the other hand, sometimes policies get denied with the argument that, well, we don't know for sure that this caused that. So how do you deal with the complexity and the politics of the logic of and the proof of causation?
Well, and I think that so causation is an interesting word, with as far as human and environmental health issues go, and that's another really important topic that I'll be talking about in my classes, which is how we do make decisions and what should the justification be for these decisions. And in the United States, we often, not always, but often tend to use cost-benefit sorts of approaches in making policy determinations. In Europe and other places, not always, but often the precautionary principle is something that is used instead. And so that's something I'll definitely be talking about in my classes and trying to get students to understand these are very different ways of looking at problems, and I think that brings consumer education into it as well. So if you are going to be doing whichever approach you take, whether it's the precautionary principle or a more of a cost-benefit type of approach, are you also going to educate the public so that they understand the implications of which approach you're taking? So if you do have chemicals that are shown to cause tumors, for instance, in a lot of different lab animals, are you going to tell the public that these are in the couch that you're buying so that they can make the choice? Do I want to, maybe it's a cheaper couch. Do I actually want my family sitting on that thing, or do I want to buy one? Maybe it's more expensive, that doesn't have those chemicals in it. Where does the education piece come into this? And I think there's an environmental justice component to a lot of these issues. There's a human rights component to a lot of these issues as well. It's, so you asked a simple question and I give you a very complicated answer.
Well, it's not that simple, but, it is a very complex concept.
So, and I'm looking forward to helping students also understand the complexities and sort of arrive at where they stand on these big questions, because none of this is cut and dry. It's a very complicated world we live in, and when you're making decisions about policy, whether it's to do with human health or the environment, there's an awful lot of things you need to weigh into those decisions.
See, that's fabulous, because that really does capture so much of what we emphasize in the program. And I think generally in the field of planning, right, is this idea that the world is complex. There are many variables at play. There's all these interrelated factors and dynamics that are always at play. So how do we help our students to make sense of that, right, in a way that truly begins to really capture that complexity, and at the same time gives opportunities and thought and strategies for how to effectively engaged in, and then affect that outcome.
And be able to communicate that to your community as you're making decisions.
And incorporate the wishes and desires and interests of the community as you're doing
exactly.
that. That community-based sort of approach to all of this, right? Well, and part of what I think is also important in our work as we're trying to deal with human rights issues, environmental justice issues, the collective good, the survival of our planet and so on. One of the things that's also important, though, is that in order to do that, we really have to also have standards of how we do it. Standards of rigor, for example. Again, some of these standards of how you assess the impact of something on something else. So one of the courses that we teach in our program, of course, is the analytical methods for planners, which you will be teaching that course starting in spring semester of 2013. So I know you have not yet completed that syllabus, but I know you've been thinking about what you're gonna include in that class.
Yeah, and I think that based on the research I've been doing, looking at a lot of the top programs around the country, and thinking about how we want to redevelop this class.
And building on David Henkel's teaching of it.
After David's work, and thinking about how can I combine all of these great resources into a class that the faculty thinks is what is needed right now for our students, and I'll be pulling from all these different resources and really trying to cover a broad array of all the possible methods that the planning students might need down the road to be solving all these complicated environmental and other types of problems in their communities.
So we have a prerequisite for that class, which is they have to have had their economics, some basic economics class, and then they have to have a basic statistics class
yes,
before they can even get into that class.
Yeah, and I think that based on my personal experience with this at Stanford recently too, it's just not worth it to try to get around these prerequisites. I think that the students should take that pretty seriously, because they're not only bringing down their fellow students, but they're just making life incredibly difficult for themselves. And it's also, if you don't have the background, you're hurting your own learning and your learning process, and trying to kind of this class is going to be a lot of new learning, as David Henkel told me in conversations. And if you're trying to incorporate new statistics learning and all this new higher level learning at the same time, I think the student would really be hurting themselves if they try to get around those prereqs. I think it's in everyone's best interest to really come into this with the right level of training. Like I said, I've made that mistake myself in some economics courses in the past, and it's I think there are better ways of doing it.
So we want our students to come in with those prerequisites completed. So I know you're excited about the classes, and I know that you're finishing up some publication from your dissertation. What are some of your other research interests? Where do you see some of your own research going?
Wow, yeah, there are.
You've got so many things on your mind right now.
Yeah, there are a lot of. Just as follow up from this, the chemicals work I've been doing, something that I think would be an incredibly interesting project would be looking at some of the things I started kind of uncovering with these interviews is just what does the public actually understand about chemicals and about consumer products, and what are their concerns around these topics. I got that perspective from the businesses, the consumer product companies, but what do consumers actually know about these topics, and what are they actually concerned about? And I think doing some surveying of the public and education of the public could be interesting as well. And also, how does that relate to income in a community like Albuquerque? If it is you have to go to Whole Foods or a store like that to get the shampoo that doesn't have chemicals X, Y, and Z in it, what are the issues around that for income and for families living at different levels in our society. So that's something that I'm really interested in, but that's just a follow on from my previous work. I have a lot of interests around climate change and around transportation kinds of issues. Yeah, I mean, you name it. It's kind of everything I've been doing in my dissertation. I've looked at through this lens of chemicals policy, but I think you could take many different environmental and human health related issues and think about them with those same tools and have a lot of really different interesting sorts of projects.
Yeah, I really like that. I like the way you have this concept of these tools, and it's tools that can be applied more broadly, right?
Yeah.
And that stem out of particular research, right? But that's very exciting.
Yeah.
And which is why not only are we very excited that you have joined our faculty, but also that I know that the students are also really excited about taking your classes. So welcome aboard. And
Well, thank you very much.
Carolyn Scruggs, Professor and Assistant Professor, Community Regional Planning, the University of New Mexico. Go Lobos.